Welcome to tune into the Voice of Truth with Riviona podcast. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some really important material you've shared, looking at the historical context of the Armenian Genocide of 1915. The argument seems to be that this wasn't just an isolated event, right, but more of a culmination.
Exactly. A tragic culmination of decades of complex tensions, policies, things simmering within the Ottoman Empire for a long, long time.
So our mission today isn't just about April 24th, 1915, though obviously that's crucial.
Right.
We're trying to unpack these, overlooked precedents.
Yeah.
To trace that past from 19th century reforms or attempted reforms all the way to the kind of systemic oppression that set the stage.
Precisely. Because the common understanding often pins the start date to April 24th, 1915, the arrests in Constantinople.
Yeah.
But the source material you mentioned argues for a much, much longer view. It actually draws a line from the 1878 Congress of Berlin all the way to the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. But to really get it, we need to go back even further.
Further than 1878.
Yes. The source suggests the Gulain Edict of 1839 is where we really need to start digging.
1839.
Right.
Like the Gulain Edict. Okay, let's get into that. What was the thinking behind it? What was it trying to achieve?
Well, you have to remember the Ottoman Empire's situation then. It was weakening internally, facing a lot of pressure from European powers.
Right. The sick man of Europe narrative was starting.
Kind of, yeah. So Sultan Abdülmecid issued this edict. On paper, it looked like a big step towards modernization.
But there was another angle.
Definitely. It was also strategic, trying to appease those European powers, maybe keep them from interfering more directly.
Okay, so what did it actually promise?
Some pretty significant things, at least in writing. It promised equality before the law for all subjects, Christian, Muslim, everyone.
That sounds like a big deal for the time.
It was huge. Plus, protection of life, honor, property, regardless of religion, fairer taxes, changes to military conscription, tackling corruption, the whole package, really.
It almost sounds, too progressive given what came later. So why does the source call these reforms largely superficial?
Good question. The source argues that the main driver wasn't necessarily, a deep belief in equality for its own sake. It was more about managing the rise of nationalism among the Christian minorities. Think about it, the French Revolution wasn't that far back.
Right, ideas of self-determination were spreading.
Exactly. And the Ottoman leadership saw these movements as a direct threat. So while the edict said all these things, actually making them happen consistently, especially out in the provinces, that was another story. Implementation was weak, often blocked.
So a gap between promise and reality. That seems like a recipe for resentment.
Absolutely. A key takeaway here is that reforms without real enforcement can actually make things worse, build up more frustration.
That makes sense. Which brings us to the next step, the 1856 Reform Edict. How did that one differ? Was it more the same?
It built on Gülhane, yeah, but it was even more explicit about Ottoman Christians. This time, there was even stronger pressure from Britain and France.
External influence ramping up.
Definitely. So this 1856 edict reaffirmed religious freedom, property rights, and, importantly, it theoretically opened up civil and military jobs to Christians.
Theoretically?
Yes, that's the key word again. It also allowed religious communities more control over their own affairs, schools, churches, that sort of thing. And it proposed mixed courts for legal cases.
So again, on paper, it looks like progress towards inclusion. But you mentioned opposition. Where did that come from?
Mostly from conservative elements within the empire. They felt these changes were undermining the state's traditional Islamic identity, eroding their own power.
Okay.
And this resistance, combined with frankly, the often half-hearted way the authorities tried to implement things.
Or didn't try.
Right. It had a major consequence. It pushed groups like the Armenian Patriarchate further away. They saw promises made, then ignored or broken.
So disillusionment grew. The feeling that true equality just wasn't possible within the system.
Exactly. That failure created fertile ground for what came next, the rise of more organized Armenian demands.
Which leads us straight to the Armenian National Assembly. This wasn't part of the Ottoman state structure, was it?
No, it emerged from within the Armenian community itself. Precisely because those promised rights weren't materializing. It became a central body for Armenians to voice their grievances, document abuses.
And push for actual change.
Yes. Figures like Kikorit Odion were crucial here, documenting everything, advocating for real reforms, both to the Ottomans and looking towards Europe.
But how did the Ottoman government see this?
With suspicion. Deepening suspicion. They started seeing any organized Armenian activity, even just asking for rights, as potentially separatist, as a threat.
So advocating for rights gets labeled as trying to break away.
That's the interpretation they lean towards, yeah. It's a crucial dynamic. A minority trying to organize for better treatment gets seen as a challenge to authority itself, which of course just ramps up the tension.
And you mentioned earlier this context of other groups, the Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians.
Yes, that historical backdrop is absolutely critical to understanding the Ottoman mindset at the time.
Can you unpack that a bit more? How did that pattern influence things?
Well, throughout the 19th century, they'd seen this cycle play out repeatedly. Christian minorities demand reforms. The state cracks down, often violently.
Wow.
That violence attracts European attention, sometimes intervention. And often, the end result is independence for that group. Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, Romanians. It happened.
So they saw the Armenians asking for reforms and thought,
There we go again. They projected those past experiences onto the Armenians, fearing their demands were just the first step towards secession, even if the initial goals were about equality within the empire.
that paranoia, that fear must have poisoned any chance for real dialogue.
It absolutely did. It created this deep-seated suspicion that made genuine progress almost impossible.
Meanwhile, what was life actually like for Armenians in the eastern provinces? Were things improving at all on the ground?
The source paints a pretty bleak picture, unfortunately. Despite all the reform talk, abuses continued. We're talking kidnappings, forced marriages, forced conversions to Islam,
Horrific.
and systemic sexual violence against women. The source emphasizes this wasn't just random incidents, but a pattern. And crucially, there was very little accountability. Perpetrators often acted with impunity.
So the promised protection just wasn't there.
Not in reality, no.
Yeah.
This massive gap between official promises and the lived experience just fueled more grievance, the feeling the state wouldn't or couldn't protect them.
Which brings us to the 1878 Berlin Congress.
Yeah.
You mentioned this earlier as a key date. What was the hope there?
The Berlin Congress was, well, a moment of significant hope for the Armenians. After the Russo-Turkish War, the big European powers were redrawing maps, settling issues.
Right.
So Patriarch Makurdish Crimean led an Armenian delegation there. Their goal was clear: appeal directly to Europe for help, get guarantees for reforms, for safety, especially in the Armenian provinces.
Trying to get international pressure involved.
Exactly. To internationalize the Armenian question, hoping that oversight could force the Ottomans to finally deliver on those promises.
But it didn't work out that way, did it? How did the Ottoman government react?
They reacted badly. Sultan Abdulhamid II and his government basically saw it as unacceptable foreign meddling in their internal affairs.
Pushing back against interference.
Hard. They dismissed the Armenian appeals, resisted any idea of international oversight in those regions. It was seen as an attack on their sovereignty.
And the consequences of that rejection.
It was a huge blow. It disillusioned the Armenians who'd hoped Europe could help, and it probably emboldened the Ottoman government, reinforcing their resistance to any reforms seen as bowing to foreign pressure or empowering Armenians. Positions hardened on both sides.
Setting the stage for worse things to come.
Unfortunately, yes, it really escalated tensions heading into the 1890s.
Okay, let's talk about the 1890s then. This seems like a decade where things really intensified. You mentioned the case of Gulizar in 1889. Tell us about that.
Yes, the Gulizar case is just a heartbreaking example of the impunity we talked about. She was an Armenian girl from Mush, abducted and raped.
And the person implicated?
A powerful Kurdish warlord, Musa Bey. But the trial that followed was, according to the source, a complete sham. He was acquitted despite the evidence.
Acquitted?
Yes. And this just caused massive outrage, not just among Armenians, but it got international attention too. It showed how little justice there was for Armenians, especially against powerful figures.
The source connects this directly to resistance efforts.
It does. It points to this specific injustice as a key factor in the formation of the Hunchak resistance group, a sense that if the state wouldn't protect them, they had to find ways to protect themselves.
Which is understandable, given the circumstances. Then, in 1890, protests erupt in Istanbul itself. That seems bold.
It was. Armenian activists like Hamperson Boyadjian and Miran Demadian organized these protests. They were desperate pleas for protection from the violence in the eastern provinces, especially from Kurdish militias who often seemed to operate freely.
So, demanding the government actually enforce the law and protect its citizens.
Yes, and interestingly, they were also putting pressure on their own leadership, the Armenian Patriarch, who some felt wasn't being forceful enough with the Ottoman authorities. It shows the level of desperation.
And this builds towards the Sassoon massacres in 1894. This sounds like a major escalation.
It was horrific, a clear turning point towards large-scale state violence. In Sasan, Armenians had started some self-defense efforts against ongoing attacks.
Uh-huh.
The Ottoman authorities, under Governor Hasan Tahsin Pasha, basically labeled any self-defense as banditry and used it as an excuse for a massive military crackdown.
Not just against fighters, but civilians.
Entirely. The source quotes a Colonel Ismail ordering his troops to eliminate all bandits with overwhelming terror. The intent was clearly widespread violence, not targeted policing.
And we have accounts of what happened.
We do, partly thanks to a British consular officer, Captain Hampden Smith. He documented atrocities in villages like Galiguzan. We're talking hundreds of unarmed civilians, women, children included, systematically killed over about 3 weeks.
Sounds devastating.
It was indiscriminate slaughter. And it sent shockwaves internationally, showing just how vulnerable Armenians were and how far the government was willing to go.
So putting all these pieces together, the failed reforms, the rising suspicion after Berlin, the impunity, the escalating violence in the 1890s, the argument is that 1915 didn't come out of nowhere.
Not at all. The source makes a very strong case that it was the culmination, the tragic endpoint of this long trajectory we've been discussing.
Decades of broken promises, systemic violence, and this growing Ottoman paranoia about Armenian calls for basic equality and security.
Exactly. That cycle. Attempt reform, face resistance, reform fails, violence escalates, international community makes noise but doesn't really act effectively. This created the context.
A context where mass violence became thinkable, then possible, then actual.
Precisely. The 1890s massacres, especially Sason, were a terrible foreshadowing of what was to come on an even larger scale in 1915.
So the key takeaway really is that understanding the Armenian Genocide requires looking back, way back before 1915, at this whole history within the Ottoman Empire.
That's the core argument, yes. The failure to reform, the escalating violence, the deep suspicion hardening after 1878, it all points towards a state increasingly unable or unwilling to manage its relationship with its Armenian population in any way other than oppression and, ultimately, elimination.
A truly disturbing picture of how state power, when unchecked and fueled by fear and paranoia, can lead to absolute catastrophe.
It is, and it leaves us with a difficult question to ponder, doesn't it? Looking back at this long, tragic path, were there points where things could have gone differently? What decisions might have altered this course? And what does this history teach us today about minority rights, about the dangers of state paranoia, and the devastating consequences when state power goes utterly unchecked against a vulnerable group? Something profound for all of us to think about.